Hello and welcome back. This is the week 12 lecture. So, we're going to be doing something a little bit different this week. We have reached the end of chapter 4. So, I pretty much said everything I wanted to say about the chapter last week, but I did forget that they included some stuff at the end of the chapter about literary criticism. They talk a little bit about sort of different types of literary criticism. So we've already covered that a little bit. I wanted to return to it today and just talk a little bit more about our second critical response paper, which is due at the end of week 12. So we didn't really talk about the first critical response in depth. I know I mentioned it. I obviously posted instructions to the assignment online in the module, but I wanted to spend a little bit more time this week talking about the assignment in sort of specific terms and just talking a little bit more about literary criticism in general, because we're going to be working on our final papers soon. So you might notice that our final chapter, the final reading that we're doing from the book this semester, is chapter 6, and that is all about how to write a literary research paper. And that is what we're doing eventually. That's our final assignment, our final paper due at the end of the semester. So we have plenty of time to work on it. And if you look at our course schedule, you'll actually notice that the entire last unit, which we're technically starting next week in week 13, that whole final unit is devoted to writing the research paper. So we're going to spend multiple weeks talking about it, but I sort of wanted to just introduce it and mention it at least a little bit here today. So we'll keep this lecture brief. We don't really have any reading to do this week from the book because I just asked you guys I went ahead and asked you to read the end of chapter 4 last week. I asked you to get to the end of the chapter. So hopefully we've already done that. If you have not done that yet, if you have not yet finished chapter 4, make sure you do that this week. And the only other thing to focus on here in week 12 is obviously the second critical response. So we are choosing one of the texts that I have posted to the modules. So if you want to go back to those examples of different literary genres that I posted back in week 3, week 5, and week 7, just like before, you can choose any of those texts, just like we did for our first critical response. So my only request would be don't choose the same text that you've already written about. Go and choose something different. I've also posted a few new texts here in the week 12 module. Just one more short story, one more lyric poem, and one more play. So if none of the old stuff appeals to you, maybe you'll enjoy one of the new texts that I've provided this week. But just pick something. One of the old ones or one of the new ones. You just need one text, of course, as your subject, and then you can get started. So let's just talk a little bit about literary criticism. I think I talked a little bit about this term when we started this current unit, when we first started talking about different critical approaches or, different schools of literary criticism that we can use to analyze literature. So as I said then, there is kind of a distinction to keep in mind between literary criticism and literary theory. We're sort of dabbling in literary theory, but since this is an introductory class, we're not getting too deep into it. But just remember that literary theory informs and influences literary criticism. So as they say in the book, there are different forms of literary criticism. So in some cases, criticism will be just analyzing or interpreting a literary text. And that's largely what we're doing. That's the type of literary criticism that we are practicing in this class, and it's the basic technique or method that we're going to be using in our research papers as well. So we've talked about this. We are analyzing these literary texts. We're making arguments about them. That's important to keep in mind, but we're trying to explain at least some aspect of how they work. That's what analysis means, right? Showing how something works. Sort of taking something apart, examining its individual parts and elements, and then putting it back together and sort of explaining how it all works. So that's what we're doing with literary texts. We can analyze anything, we can analyze any number of objects, but in this case, in this class, obviously we're analyzing literature. So our ultimate goal with this kind of literary criticism is to make arguments and to arrive at original interpretations about the text that we're focusing on. Bring something new to the table, make some new observations or some new points about a particular character, or something to do with setting, or something to do with, poetic language like imagery or figures of speech. We're trying to produce original thoughts, original studies of these literary texts. That's largely what we've been doing throughout this semester, and we will continue to do it. But the book points out that there's another strand of literary criticism, another type that's more focused on evaluation. Not so much interpretation, but evaluation, evaluating the texts. These are often going to come in the form of book reviews, things that you might see in more popular publications. And yeah, they're going to be making some of the same moves as the more scholarly type of criticism that we've been engaging in, but the focus is a little bit different. We've all probably read movie reviews, book reviews usually work the same way. It's an evaluation. The critic is determining whether or not the text is good and worth experiencing. So usually, along with that evaluation will be some kind of recommendation to the audience. Go and see this movie. Go and pick up this book, or don't. So those are the two major types. They throw out some different terms in the chapter, but I don't think we need to worry about those too much. We just need to remember that some literary criticism is focused on evaluation, and those are kind of like reviews, and then other literary criticism will be more focused on analysis and interpretation, and that's the kind of criticism that we often call scholarly, more academic, and obviously that's why we are doing it in here. But don't forget, we've also kind of experienced a little bit of literary theory. So literary theory is simply referring to different critical styles and different ideologies that exist outside of the world of literature, different ideologies or systems of belief that we can use to help us analyze lit. So we've kind of seen a little bit of this over the last couple of weeks, particularly most recently when we were talking about context-based critical approaches. We mentioned Marxism, feminism, post-colonialism. Those are all different critical schools, and they're all very much based on certain ideologies, certain kind of belief systems that exist in the world and can apply to a lot of different things, but we are using them to work with literature. So that's how other theories can sort of infiltrate literature. But also, literary theory can involve a lot of the elements that we've been looking at, literary elements involving plot or character, but also structural elements involving form. We've talked about those too, like if we're looking at poetry, rhyme scheme, meter, stuff like that. So we haven't really read theory, but a lot of the critical approaches that we've looked at are influenced by certain theories, both inside and outside of literary study. So just keep that in mind. And we even talked a little bit about film theory last week. So when I was talking about the male gaze and certain things having to do with sort of a feminist approach to movies, a lot of that stuff came from film theory. These were theorists using psychology, using other disciplines, but using that stuff to look at movies and to look at how gender works in movies specifically. So they formulate theories, and then critics come along, both academics, scholars, professors, but also journalists, people who write movie and book reviews for popular magazines, newspapers, and websites. These people come along and they use certain aspects of the theory to write their criticism. Whether that's a more academic style of criticism based on interpretation, or if it's that more kind of popular style of criticism like we've talked about, that's more focused on evaluation, a review, a recommendation as to whether or not the book is good. So this all falls under the heading of criticism. But again, just be aware of the different types. So again, we've probably all read book reviews or movie reviews where the author is usually going to work for a newspaper or maybe a website. And again, book reviews or movie reviews are typically written for a general audience. So just about anybody who might be interested in the text could read the review. The review's not going to have a lot of specialized language. There's not really going to be references usually. There's not usually going to be like a bibliography or sources being cited. It's going to be a relatively light and quick read. And if we go to pop culture websites or, just about anywhere online, we can find reviews, and you can also find them in popular newspapers like the New York Times, popular like entertainment magazines, certainly. So they're common. We see them all the time, and they can be written often by journalists. But again, so they are critics, right? Those are critics, literary critics or film critics, but the more academic type of scholarship, the more academic type of criticism that we're also focusing on, that we are doing ourselves, that's what students do, that's what scholars do. People who study literature, who work specifically in that field, they're producing slightly different work. In some ways, they're doing some of the same things that reviewer might be doing, but the focus is different. It's going to be denser if we're looking at, academic criticism. The articles will be longer. We can often call these scholarly essays. And that's a term the book uses, and I think it's a good term for us to use. We are eventually producing scholarly essays of our own at the end of the semester. That's what our final paper is. It's a seminar paper or a scholarly essay. So that's what people like me produce as part of our jobs. In addition to teaching, most literature professors will publish. They will write scholarly essays or even scholarly books about authors or texts or certain literary movements, a bunch of the kind of stuff that we've been studying throughout the semester. But again, we are going to be using sources. We're going to be citing our sources. We might have footnotes. We will definitely have a bibliography. So it's a different type of text that we are creating versus the magazine critic or the newspaper book critic or your favorite critic on your favorite, arts and entertainment website. They're different kinds of work. They're different kinds of writing, but there can be some overlap. They might both talk about certain elements of the text, the same elements. They might both be, interested in characters or setting or certain metaphors. But again, the book critic is largely saying this is good or this is bad. You should see this or you shouldn't. Whereas the academic, the academic style criticism is more focused on arriving at original conclusions about the text, finding something new, illustrating something new, uncovering something that no one has really talked about before, or maybe just shedding some new light on something that has been discussed before. But again, we don't have to lose sight of the fact that book reviews also have arguments, right? They are argumentative, but again, it's more of a general, it's good or not, see it or not. It's written for a more general audience, and it's going to be a little bit easier and quicker to read. So, just be aware of those differences. And again, what we are doing, we are operating within the school of scholarly criticism based on interpretation and analysis. But that doesn't mean that we can't evaluate a little bit as well. Just like the magazine critics can do some analysis, and they often do. They'll look at certain elements, they'll make observations, they'll engage in some analysis, but that's not their exclusive focus. We, as scholarly critics, as literature students, we can engage in some evaluation. We can say this is an effective technique that this author is using. This is an effective or moving passage in the text. We can evaluate, we can judge, but that's not necessarily our primary focus. Our focus is to arrive at those original interpretations and conduct original analysis so we can make, again, sort of original arguments. So that's what we're doing. And just a few things to consider as you get moving on the second critical response. I noticed with the first critical response, plenty of us did well, but a lot of us needed to get more specific. So no matter what text you guys choose, if you want to just kind of get into the nuts and bolts of how to conduct scholarly analysis, how to do this kind of scholarly criticism, one of the first steps is to get specific and to find specific examples of whatever it is you're talking about. Find examples of those things in the text. So if you want to talk about imagery, if you want to talk about a certain character's motivations, it doesn't matter. Whatever literary element, whatever aspect of the text you want to discuss, you need to find examples of that thing in the text. How does it play out in the text? What does it look like in the text? Show your audience whatever it is. If you're talking about imagery, show us examples of imagery, and not just one. If you want to make the case that imagery is really important in this text for whatever reason, or imagery is doing something important or doing something interesting, that's great, but you have to illustrate that through textual examples. Remember, the text is your primary source of evidence. We're not doing research yet. We eventually will be, obviously, on the research paper, the final assignment, that literary research paper, also a real bona fide scholarly essay. Yeah, that's going to include research, but right now we're just doing critical responses, not a full-blown scholarly essay. We're not there yet. So for a short critical response, you're still engaging in criticism, but it's shorter. It's more condensed. We don't necessarily have to go out and do research, but we need evidence. We still need evidence. But for us, the evidence will come from whatever poem, short story, or play we are analyzing. So not all of us are doing that enough. And remember, you want to mostly avoid plot summary. Now, in some cases, you will need to discuss the plot. You will need to mention important moments or events in the plot. And you might need to explain what's going on at a particular point or a particular scene or passage that you might be quoting or talking about. You might need to tell us, yeah, this character's doing this. His, friend just died. Now he's going here. He's doing this. But keep it brief. We don't need a play-by-play account of everything that happens in the story. And I know it's tempting to provide plot summary because it's frankly kind of easy. And as long as we've read the text, we can do it without really thinking too hard. And in some cases, we might think it's necessary, like, oh, I need to make sure everybody knows what happens. But again, that's kind of more important for a review. right? A reviewer doesn't want to give away everything, but they will engage in some plot summary. That's part of how the audience will decide if they want to go and see the movie or check out the book, right? Here's some things that happen. Here are the important characters. A lot of book reviews or movie reviews will provide that kind of summary, that general outline, that overview type summary, because that's part of evaluation. That's part of whether or not they're going to recommend the text. But we're not really doing that. We don't have to focus as much on evaluating how good the text is. So, and we're not trying to get people to go and see it or not, or read it or not necessarily. That's not our primary goal. So we don't have to do a lot of plot summary. It's not necessary, especially if you're focusing on really specific literary elements. You don't have to tell us everything that happens in the plot, especially if you're working with a lengthy work of fiction, obviously a novel, but even a long short story, even something like Hacienda, which was one of our short story examples. A lot happens, right? A lot happens in that story. It's not terribly long, but a lot's going on. So if you want to talk about a particular character or the setting in Mexico or, language, whatever, you don't have to tell us every single thing that happens in the plot. Just tell us the things that matter to your argument, right? If you're talking about a particular character, tell us some of the things that character does. But we might not need to know what some other character does because we're talking about character A. So focus on character A. Keep your plot summary, confined to what relates or applies to character A. Make sure you keep a clear focus. It can be easy to fall into plot summary just because it's, again, kind of natural and it's easy. But it doesn't always help us, because if you're talking about literary elements, if you're trying to make a larger argument beyond just telling us what happens, then the plot summary isn't really helping you to do those larger things. So only do the plot summary that helps you to make your points about your chosen elements, whatever it is that you're focusing on. And remember to be argumentative. Another thing I noticed in the first critical response is that a lot of us just sort of made safe, larger statements about the text. In some cases, they were like the commonly accepted, well-known interpretations. In some cases, I kind of said them in lecture, or they're just the interpretations that many, many people have had in the past. They're online, they're easy to find. But again, that's not what we're going for. You don't just need to tell me what the big theme of the text is. I mean, in a lot of cases, we already know that. We already know the larger message. It's been sort of discussed and covered and addressed by now. We have to find something new. I mean, I'm not saying you have to be the first person to ever make certain observations, but make an original argument that's different from what I've said or what other people have said. It's yours, right? It might be similar to what other people have said. You might agree with certain things that other people have said, but if it's coming from you, it'll always be original. It will always be at least a little bit different from other interpretations and other criticisms. So don't go looking for your argument. You need to develop it yourself. Don't look for it elsewhere. Come up with it on your own, based on your own reading, based on your own experiences and your own knowledge. And, you might want to go back to what we were talking about recently with reader response. Remember, that critical school really emphasizes the power of the reader. Remember, the formalists and some of those older literary critics and scholars, they didn't really care about the reader. They just wanted to focus on language and stay inside the text. But later, in later decades, there was kind of a pushback against that approach, and more people started to say, hey, we do need to consider the reader. In many ways, the reader assembles the meaning. The reader figures out the meaning and really creates the meaning. And I gave you guys that long example about Stanley Fish and his two classes and how his religious poetry class basically analyzed and interpreted a list of names. And it's kind of funny because those weren't intended to be a poem, but the students could still read it as a poem because readers have that kind of power. Readers really get to decide what it is that they're reading and what it means and why it matters. We can do all of that, and we do all the time. So just remember that, you should feel empowered. Your job isn't to just regurgitate what other people have said about these texts. And your job is not to regurgitate what I say. I'm not going to talk about the text that I'm posting this week, but I did talk about the text that I posted previously. So you don't need to repeat my points. You can certainly use anything that I say in lecture. Anything that you find in the book, you will need to cite it if it's coming from the book. But you can use anything I talk about. This is yours. I'm giving it to you. But again, use my stuff or use the book to make your own points. Use my stuff or the book to support your own original claims and your own original argument. Don't just repackage what I've already said. That's not contributing anything new. So strive for originality. You can make points that are pretty small, points that are related to just an individual element. Like, I just want to explore imagery. I'm going to spend my whole response, looking at different examples of imagery and they all do different things. And I have a point about just imagery. And you don't have to talk about anything but imagery if you have enough to say to meet the length requirement, but you could throw in some other elements as well. You can talk about figurative language. You can talk about another element, put them all together, and maybe they show us something or they tell us something about the text. But of course, you can also zero in on themes. You can make kind of larger, broader arguments about the meaning of the text. But again, put your own spin on it. Come up with something a little bit different from the norm or from what other people have already said. Just look for an angle, look for something that grabs your interest. And that applies to choosing a text to analyze. And then once you've selected that literary text, what stands out as you're reading it? And you should go back and read it again, even if you've already read it once. Refresh your memory. And as you go back through it, what stands out? What grabs your interest? What seems really important? Like if you're just thinking about how the theme of the text gets expressed, like whatever you think the text means or whatever you think it's saying, okay, keep that in mind and then ask yourself, and how does it say that? Like what elements express the theme? What kind of language? What does the author do? What does the narrator do? What do characters do? How does the theme become clear to readers? And that's how you can start uncovering the specific elements or scenes that interest you. And again, get specific. Don't just talk about what happens in general. Pick out specific moments. That's why I say, grab some passages, grab some scenes. Literary texts have scenes just like movies. Little small episodes that happen in a single location, featuring a small group of the same characters, kind of in the same place, the same action. Look for stuff like that. So I always tell students, when you're performing literary analysis, before you start writing, before you start putting together your draft, you really just need to sit down with your chosen text, pretend that our textbook is your chosen text, and you need to find the stuff that you want to focus on. So like I said, look for specific passages or scenes or specific lines, specific words. You can start looking for some of those specific examples that you're going to need to share with us later on. So if you're finding examples of imagery, make some notes, underline those, highlight those if possible. If you can print out a physical copy of the text, or even if you're just reading it online, you can jot down some notes as you read and just sort of figure out, okay, what do I want to get into in my body paragraphs? Once you have a sense of kind of what you want to do, what you want to say, what can you give us? What can you dive into in those bodies? What literary elements or what elements of language? What interesting things can you dig into and develop original ideas about? So I would really sit down with your text before you start writing. Sit down, read it again, look for interesting stuff that you want to talk about, and then you might want to put together an outline. I'm actually going to post probably Monday a sort of just a rough sketch of an outline for the second critical response. You guys can use my outline. You can make your own style of outline, but I'm just kind of going to show you how you can plan some of your body paragraphs, how to build successful body paragraphs. Obviously, we want the thesis in our intro paragraph. That's when you announce what you're going to be doing, and then we get into the bodies. That's when you actually develop your ideas. That's when you bring in your textual support, those specific examples from the text, and you can offer more detail and elaboration. But you really need to sit down with your text before outlining. Mark some stuff in the text, jot down some notes, and then you can outline. You can start building your body paragraphs around some of that interesting stuff that you found. So if you have several examples of imagery, okay, maybe you're going to talk about those in your first body paragraph. And then you found this other thing and this scene here, and you can talk about that in your second or third body paragraph. That's how we can get a plan in place. That's all an outline is. It's a plan, a blueprint for the paper. And then once you have that outline, you're ready to start writing. So I'll post some more stuff that might be helpful later in the day on Monday. I'll have that outline posted. A few other tips will be included there. So take a look. If you have any questions, let me know. And remember, you can choose any of the older texts that we've already read from weeks 3, 5, or 7. And you can also read the stuff that I posted in week 12. So good luck with the assignment. Let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you next week. And next week, we start talking about the final paper.